Welcome back. As we continue our series, I want to point out that there once again is the name of Gaius Marius, whom we talked about quite a bit in the previous video on the social war. You need to pay close attention to Gaius Marius because, as I've been trying to build up here, his presence is completely groundbreaking for the late Roman Republic, and in fact the changes that he made, such as with the military, as we talked about in the previous video, completely transform the way that the Roman military and the Roman politics in general proceed. And in fact, that will turn out to be one of the contributing factors for the loss of power and influence over the Roman Republic of the Senate. Because as private citizens are now capable of getting hold of military power, even though technically by the Constitution they're not supposed to be able to do that. Okay, now as we've been talking about, we've had a series of military crises that begin to infect the Roman Republic. So we talked about some of those earlier ones, the Cimbri-Teutones invasion. In the previous video, we just went through the Social War, the conflict between the Romans and their Italian allies. And now we come to the first major military threat the Romans had for quite some time, and that was the king Mithridates in 88 BC. From the province around the Black Sea called Pontus. Let's put his date in here. Clearly, Mithridates' invasion of the Black Sea province of Rome is one of numerous historic events happening at this time. So by itself, although it obviously was a very serious matter militarily for the Romans to have that portion of the Republic suddenly become destabilized, this particular incident has much more historical significance for what happens in Rome as a consequence of the invasion. What happens here is that initially the generalship for the campaign to counter Mithridates is going to be given by the Senate to one of their own, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Similarly to Marius, Sulla, who was an aristocratic senator, had a long, distinguished military career. And he was, at that time, one of the most prominent, influential senators in the Senate, and became the Senate's choice for leading the campaign against Mithridates. It was at this point, however, that the next major break in the Roman Republic occurred. At this point, here's Gaius Marius. Marius teamed up with the current tribune of the plebs, whose name is Publius Sulpicius Rufus. I'll just refer to him as Sulpicius. This is the occasion on which this becomes important. Remember that we talked in the civics videos about the intercessio, which was the absolute veto that the tribunes held over the patrician aristocratic senate. At this point, Sulpicius interposed the intercessio against the appointment of Sulla to general against Mithridates. At that point, the tribune assembly convened, and Sulpicius called for the appointment of Marius instead of Sulla to take on the general position against Mithridates. This was, as it turned out, a disastrous decision for the future of Rome. First of all, Sulpicius was subsequently assassinated, not surprisingly, by cohorts of Sulla. Second, Sulla, when he heard abroad from Rome that he had been removed from the position of general, refused to acknowledge this particular appointment, and he did the first thing that ever had happened in the history of Rome. He brought together his forces, and he led a campaign against the city of Rome and took it over militarily, thereby, of course, essentially removing the Senate from oversight of Rome at that point. When he did so, of course, he ousted all of the supporters of Marius, as well as Gaius Marius himself. Marius tried to organize a counter-revolt and was able to, in fact, get back into Rome, but then Sulla organized another revolt and got Marius back out again. Subsequent to that, Marius, who actually was consul in the year 86 BC, died while away. But Marius' supporters continued to fight on his behalf, and the conflict went back and forth between the two sides until it ultimately escalated into a civil war between the supporters of Marius and the supporters of Sulla. Unfortunately, without the leader there, the supporters of Marius found themselves outnumbered and eventually defeated by the supporters of Sulla, and finally Sulla got into tyrannical type power in 81 BC. His position at that point was dictator. We talked about that position previously. The dictator was an emergency special powers of, appointee of the Senate, essentially there to see to it that the Roman Republic would come to no harm. Sulla had Marius declared as a public enemy, and that's how he received that position. And then he ended up having that position perpetually. And the critical years, as we'll speak about in the next video, were 81 BC to 79 BC. So this fraying of relationships between the patrician and the plebeian side of things advances the Roman Republic further in its progress toward ultimate decline. So in the next video, we'll highlight a little bit further this politician Sulla. The Sullan period, 81 to 79 BC, was for its day one of the worst crises of dictatorship at Rome, and it too would have enormous ramifications for the later history. One important point, of course, was that Sulla took away the power of the tribunes. So we'll speak more about that in the next video.